What's up guys, JayzTwoCents here, and if I sound a little nasally, it's not my typical whiny self. I'm getting over a bit of a cold. When Jerry came down and visited me, he left a present behind and we got it. So, with that said, we're gonna get through this as best we can, but you guys know I like to take topics straight from the audience, and I got this random tweet the other day from Tectonic15 on Twitter. He says, "Hey Jay, could you make a video about how to configure game settings, and also maybe explain what some of the terminologies, thanks you." There's a few typos in there, but I didn't want to, I didn't want to paraphrase. But I think that's a great idea because you can often increase your gameplay experience by just decreasing or manipulating some of the settings. So we're going to go through a couple of games. We're going to talk about the game settings on a high level, what they do, and then how you can actually get better FPS, and which settings are kind of not important and which ones really tax your graphics card. So let's do it. MSI brings ultra-thin gaming to life with their new GS65 Stealth. The 4.9mm bezel, 144Hz 1080p panel, NVIDIA graphics, and 8th gen Intel CPUs make the new GS65 Stealth a true powerhouse with a small footprint. Find out more on how to pre-order by following the link in the description below. All right, so I'm gonna use Rise of the Tomb Raider here to just sort of demonstrate some of the general settings you'll find in most games, and then we'll kind of talk about some other things as we move forward. Each game is gonna kind of have its own list of settings, and that's obviously based on the developers, and a lot of those settings are gonna be specific to the games. But there are quite a few settings that are also applicable to all games because it is general type of technology that you can kind of manipulate to give yourself a better gaming experience, get better FPS, without having to have an image that looks like crap. I'm also using a GTX 1060 6GB because I feel like that's a graphics card that's going to really more accurately represent kind of the mid-range of what people are using out in the real world. I'm also using 1080p for this because it's gonna have a better impact in showing you what happens with anti-aliasing. We're gonna spend the time on things that are pretty much applicable to all games, like for instance, anti-aliasing. All of your objects on the screen are being drawn by millions of different triangles. The problem is no matter how many of those you make or how much you try and smooth the edges, you always have what's called staircasing, which is where they look kind of jagged. It's like trying to make a round object in Minecraft. So you have to rely on anti-aliasing to make that round object look round. Now there's different types of anti-aliasing technologies. There's post-processing and then there's super sampling. So right now with our our anti-aliasing off, you can see we're getting 157 FPS in this screen. And that's one of the reasons why I'm using Rise of the Tomb Raider, because you can actually see the changes happen in real time without having to restart the game, and you can get a better sense of what's actually happening on the screen. So we're getting 157, 158 FPS with anti-aliasing off. If I turn it on and hit apply, you can see it drop down a little bit, down to about 151. Now FXAA is just applying a slight blur to the image overall. It's not actually actively processing anything, it's just sort of tricking you into thinking it looks smoother. The problem is the image overall also looks a little bit blurrier as well. Now we have SMAA, which is a much newer type of post-processing AA that we've seen over the last several years, where it's basically just a more enhanced FXAA. It's not a huge impact to performance. And you can see the SMAA obviously gave us a bit more of an impact because we are down to 135 FPS, so that was about a 15 FPS hit right there. Now if we look at SSAA 2X, which is super sampling, that means it's going to super sample the image 2 times to make it look even sharper. We're basically blowing up the image, smoothing it out, and then shrinking it back down to size. Now watch what happens to the FPS as soon as I hit apply to this one. We just lost approximately 45 FPS. So we went from 135 FPS down to 90. Now if we hit 4X here, our image is going to definitely start to look more sharp, but look, we dropped all the way down to 60 FPS. So this is why SMAA is my recommendation in terms of middle ground, in terms of screen graphics quality and performance. Now VSync is one of those things that get asked an awful lot. Jay, should I turn it on? Should I turn it off? Blah, blah, blah. It really depends on a few different things. First of all, how strong is your graphics card? If you have a 60 Hertz panel, but you have like a 1080 Ti, and you're running 1080p, you're gonna be sending way more than 60 frames per second to the panel. Now, Hertz can also be thought of as a frame per second. So what VSync basically does is tells the graphics card to wait until the monitor says it's ready for the next image before sending it. Now the only problem with VSync being on in that scenario is if your graphics card is significantly faster than your panel, then you can actually introduce input lag into your game. Now my recommendation here is if you're running a G-Sync panel with an NVIDIA graphics card, turn on G-Sync in the NVIDIA control panel and leave V-Sync off in your games. Same thing goes for AMD. If you have an AMD graphics card and a FreeSync panel, then you're going to want to leave FreeSync on, turn VSync off in your games. Unfortunately, if you have a FreeSync panel and an NVIDIA graphics card, or an AMD graphics card and a G-Sync panel, those are mismatched, they won't talk to each other, and you're kind of lost out on that option, so you would want to run VSync if that's the case. So let's talk about presets. Presets are basically a bucket of settings that the developers have determined, like at this graphics quality and these different settings is what these settings down below should be. And as you can see, we are at the lowest FPS, or lowest preset, as I mentioned right here. That basically means everything that could possibly be turned on in terms of like graphical enhancements is off. Now, the second we switch this to low, you can see there was a dramatic change on the screen. Look at that. If we go from lowest to low, there's a dramatic change. And the reason for that is when you're on the lowest settings, there are absolutely no shadows being drawn whatsoever. Shadows are the most taxing graphics setting that you can enable on your system. Fortunately, now the games have been evolved to the point to where those graphic settings and those shadow settings can be split into different toggles. So you can actually turn on some types of shadows and turn off others, where in the past it was just shadows yes or no, and that was it. So as you can see, even in low now versus lowest, there is a very dramatic change because we have shadow quality turned on to medium, which is off before, and level of detail is also set to medium. Now, if we go up to medium on the preset, you can see we're increasing the overall depth of a lot of our colors, foliage. You can see her hair right here. On low and medium, there's no reflection. On medium, there's reflection on her hair. High, very high, and obviously there was a significant hit to our FPS as well. We're still running 70 FPS or 69 FPS with very high. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to lowest and turn these on one at a time so you can kind of see what's happening here. Now these two settings right here, texture quality and anisotropic filter, they kind of go hand in hand. Texture quality is going to be the sharpness of the texture being applied to the objects. In this case, the rocks, her pants, dirt. All of this has an image that's laid on it to say, this is dirt, this is a rock, this is snow. And that's how you know what you're actually looking at. Otherwise, it's just a blob of an object. Anisotropic filtering is going to be the processing of those images when they are not being looked at straight on. I will typically set that to 16x. It's a fairly low impact on your graphics settings, but it can make a big impact in terms of graphics appearance on your screen. So now if we turn up our texture quality with our anisotropic filter turned up to 16x, you'll start to notice things overall on the screen look a whole lot better. So you can see now it just finished reloading on the medium and things look a whole lot sharper. And then if you set it to anything, considered high, then this game is asking for at least 4 gigabytes of VRAM. And the reason for that is textures are stored in your frame buffer. That is the amount of VRAM that is on your graphics card. So the more VRAM, the higher resolution textures, and the more textures that can actually be stored into that frame buffer ready to be called by the graphics engine because it's already there and ready to go. So not having enough VRAM could also lead to a lot of the stuttering that you would see in your games. Now, the stuttering isn't necessarily the graphics card not being able to keep up as much as the VRAM buffer is constantly saturated, so it's having to do a lot of file swapping in that buffer, which is what's creating the stuttering. It can't draw the images on the screen if it can't pull the data it needs from the buffer, so that's where a lot of the stuttering actually comes from. Now let's talk about shadows, because like I said, shadows are the most taxing thing you can do on your game settings. Now you can see right here, obviously there's some depth. You can see that we've got rocks and we've got contour and stuff going on right here. You can also see the sun is coming in from the right over here. So we do have some shadow obviously being created. But this is still a very flat looking image, and the reason for that is because we have all of our graphics settings pretty much set to off. So what happens if we start to turn on shadows? Well, you'll notice that got a whole lot darker right there because the sun is over here on the other side of these rocks, which now means that just like you would expect in real life, this side should be darker than the other side. Now this actually looks pretty good. In my opinion, this is actually a very good looking image right here. And it's not doing a whole lot of terrible work to our FPS. We're still getting nearly 100 FPS or almost 40 FPS higher than the refresh rate of this panel. So I could turn on VSync, be locked at 60 and never have a problem. But if you want to know what can really make the things look good, but also really hurt your performance, obviously you could turn this up to high, very high. And what you'll notice here, the difference between off and medium is just whether or not the shadow is even rendered. But if you look at the difference between high and very high, it's usually just the edges and the way the edges is being handled here. Now, ambient occlusion, you'll find this in pretty much any title within the last 5 or 6 plus years. This is basically the way objects affect neighboring objects in terms of shadows. So ambient occlusion on, you can see now we are getting even more depth to our shadows here. So this is just a much smarter way of creating a very realistic looking shadow. Motion blur, pretty obvious. A lot of people don't like motion blur. The reason being is it tends to be a bit ridiculous. So as I'm moving the screen around right here, you can see it looks like I'm just motorboating her. I'm sorry guys, that's not on purpose, I swear. Doesn't really do too much of a hit on your graphics card, but it's really a personal taste thing. I enjoy games that allow you to actually tune the motion blur. But let's talk about tessellation, because that's something that came out with DX11. A lot of people still don't really understand it, and I have a really good demonstration for you on that. All right guys, so this is Heaven Benchmark, and this is a free. You guys can actually download this. It's Heaven Benchmark. So you can see we've got this cobblestone road. Not a very smooth one if you ask me in terms of trying to roll an old handcart or something on there. That's because the tessellation settings right here are kind of cranked. This is basically what this road would probably more so look like if it were a real medieval time type road. But you notice how the rocks and stuff here look extremely square and not very realistic. Tessellation is just the amount of angular detail that's being applied to objects. It's actually taking the angles and the structure of the object and just giving you more enhancement to it. Now, Heaven Benchmark has a slider here which allows you to just completely make this as ridiculous as possible. Look at that. This is like a little bass test. Okay, you guys get the point. So this video is directly in response to you, guy. I forgot. So this video is a direct response to you, Tectonic15. I thought it was a good subject to talk about. There's a lot of ways that you can increase your graphics performance without having to necessarily sacrifice in graphics quality and not have to go out and necessarily buy a new graphics card. But we all know that's fun. We love buying new graphics cards. Guys, if you have a topic you want me to touch on, please put it in the comments below, or do like Tectonic did, tweet me, and if it's a good one, you'll probably see a video about it. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I will see you in the next one. I'm gonna do the best I can to not like sniffle and stuff, because, you know. Okay. Okay.
Awesome demo.